Thank you. In fact, the panel is so powerful, I got a bit rattled how I'm going to moderate this session. So I hope I will be able to do justice to this program this morning. Before we start, I would like to say Arun Susde, Selamat Pagi and good morning to all the participants this morning. I am Wasiha Hassan, the moderator for this very important session titled ASEAN Post-Pandemic Recovery Towards the New Normal, Advancing and Accelerating Economic Growth and Prosperity, and how will RCEP and CPTPP promote stronger economic growth in ASEAN. Now, RCEP stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes other than ASEAN member nations, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and South Korea. CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which came into effect in December 2018, is viewed by the World Bank as a long and complicated application process. Entry to the agreement requires a consensus among existing signatories, and applicants must work with every member to satisfy concerns. Not all ASEAN members are also yet members of the CPTPP. Therefore, it's a rather complex organization, and therefore we would like to hear later some of the views from our representatives. We have representatives from the academia, think tank, government, as well as a representative from South Korea, who is, I consider as an outsider looking inside into ASEAN, and who may be able to considerably give an out-of-the-box thinking how we could improve the ASEAN relationship, intra-relationship, as well as with the external parties. Last night at the dinner, and this morning at the Prime Minister's opening speech, we were given very promising information and what I will call promising for future for ASEAN. And many of our people in ASEAN, we can look at ASEAN in both ways. The glass is half full or the glass is half empty. So far we have been looking at the positive way, the glass is half full. But we would like to trigger some positive thoughts as well to see how we can make the half glass even fuller with greater cooperation between the ASEAN members as well as our partners who are very eager to become what we call ASEAN plus individual countries, you know. And you can see that from the economic summits that's going on now, how many countries are willing to come and work with ASEAN. The demand is very great for everyone to work with ASEAN, because ASEAN is the 5th largest economic bloc, and soon we will be probably number 4 in another couple of years or in the next decade or so. Therefore, most countries see ASEAN as a very powerful bloc to work with, and that is seen by the interest and enthusiasm by the various nations to work with ASEAN. Having said that as an introduction, I also like to tell a little story of an old man who had 4 or 5 sons, and then he found them disunited. So he called each one of them and gave them a stick to break. Of course, they were very easily breakable. Everyone broke the sticks, and he told the children, okay, bring 6 sticks. The 6 children brought 6 sticks. And he tied all the 6 sticks together and asked them to break, and they couldn't break. So the same thing applies for ASEAN. If we see ourselves as 10 individual nations, we can be easily broken. But if we see ourselves as 10 nations which are combined together, nobody can break us up. With that little story, I will move on to our program today. And I will welcome our online participants as well. And I will start with His Excellency, Dr. Chhem. From your perspective, how would you share your views on how ASEAN should move forward towards the new normal, advancing and accelerating economic growth and prosperity? We have seen 3 years of problems during the disruption of the pandemic, etc. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, distinguished panelists. Good morning, everybody. Today, first, I'm not sitting here as a minister from the Prime Minister's office, but more as a scholar, historian, and as a medical doctor. So I see things maybe differently. This pandemic, this disaster from the economic perspective. But yet, economics actually is about human well-being, and we tend to forget that. So I will look at 2 dimensions of this pandemic and post-pandemic era. First is from the historical perspective. There are so many reports now, post-recovery, the new normal, a lot of new term become a buzzword and empty of substance. And as a medical doctor with nuclear physics as a background, I like that we need to define the term, what does it mean? And defining term of post-pandemic require knowledge of history. This is not the first pandemic. This is not the last. So what ASEAN should do, what not only ASEAN, the whole world should do, is to address this post-pandemic. Is a wrong term because we're not out of the wood yet. And also look at preparing to fight the future pandemics. So from the historical point of view, if you look at main pandemics in the past, like the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century that killed over hundreds of millions of people. Last century, we call the Spanish flu. Actually, it's a wrong term. It's not Spanish. It broke out in the US before all that. So that's the reason why in the current time in WHO recommend not to use a country as an origin. Let's not forget that the viruses are here on Earth 3 billion of years ago, long before human species came to be, let's say Homo sapiens 150 years ago. So the intruders are not the viruses, human animal, we are intruders, we must recognize that. So from the Spanish flu, actually, 1916 to 18 for 2 years, there were, depending on statistics, that 500 million of people have been affected, and about scholars tend to say that somewhere between 30 to 50 million people die. And then more recently, this is worrisome. The number of pandemics has increased over the last centuries because of our lifestyle. COVID disease is caused by the virus, SARS-CoV-2. The pandemic is caused by human. Our lifestyle, cluster in big cities over centuries, mass migration, transport, mass tourism, etc. So all these are part of our lifestyle, and we have to learn how to live with the viruses. So that from the historical perspective, but if you were to set up economic policy and business policy, I think you should have some idea of what happened in the past because decision to be made by top policymaker is how to balance life and livelihood. As a medical doctor, I make sure that people don't die. As a policymaker, economist, to make sure that the economic don't break up and lead to death by starvation. So it's a very difficult balance for that. And we look at a study from the Black Death, for example. They found out that over decades, even a century later, there was a change of the role of the working class. So this impact is important. Capital accumulation, structural change, welfare distribution also. So all this have to be kept in mind. And most of all, by that time, during the medieval time in Europe, there was a transition of the style of governance from feudalism to centralized government, and also a production from rural to urban. This is what we see in this part of the world, but it happened 300 years ago and 700 years ago when the Black Death affected Europe. So those historical facts are very important to consider. And during the Spanish flu, in 1918, there was a study over 43 countries. I have some statistics. They found out that in each individual country, there's an average decrease of 10%, 7% of GDP, and a loss of average of 10% of loss of income per country. So that's the statistics, that's the numbers. But beyond that, the intangible is that beyond the statistical data, there is a significant social trust, loss of social trust. Human behavior, social, psychological disturbance should be parameters of all this policy to address this, if we can call, the post-pandemic. And these widespread psychological, social, psychological, those disorders should be addressed at all levels. There is economic depression, like the Great Depression in 1929 in the US and affect Europe. There's also a moral depression. So economists has a role to play, but social worker who take care of well-being community, psychiatrists, psychologists has a role to play, and this tend to be forgotten in the past. And any attempt to build resilient and sustainable recovery in post-pandemic requires a comprehensive approach of both public well-being and economic disturbance. If you address the money side only, the trade only, there will be no prosperity because people are affected. Look at what happened in Cambodia here. We are still living the post-Khmer Rouge regime. The trauma is still there. I worked for the last 20 years as a senior fellow at the Institute of Atomic Bomb Disease in Nagasaki. Almost 80 years later, the trauma is still there. Longitudinal studies has shown that the trauma, mental trauma, has been passed from generation to generation, and there were 80 years already. So this COVID that has affected more than ever compared to the last two pandemic of the century is a heavy one, and the psychological social disturbance had to be considered and addressed. SARS in 2003 caused only 8,000 people, 8,000 were affected, and maybe 800 were killed. MERS was small, but this one is big, 600 millions, almost more than 6 million of deaths, and it's continued. It's been more than 2 years. So that's what the historical perspective can help you regarding the post-pandemic policy. So that's the first part. Historical context has to be considered. Number two is the technology part. From this angle, history has taught us from the past that any pandemics and epidemics led to creativity, the need to create the function and become a machine to trigger new technology and adoption of new technology. Look at a simple case here, online learning in higher education. I proposed online education in this part of the world when I wrote my thesis some 25 years ago in ASEAN higher education, that you should prepare for online learning. It went slowly, but the best education reformer was SARS-CoV-2. That virus came and forced us to adopt online and higher education. So that's important. So this is another example where a pandemic trigger innovative ideas, solution, and the use of technology. And we are so lucky that today the digital technology is rampant, widespread everywhere. So how can we look into technology as a tool to address present and the future? First, you need a new type of leadership, technology leadership. It requires some literacy on technology. You cannot lead the millennials and the Gen Z with the mindset of baby boomers. If you want a clear policy to address the impact, economic impact of digital technology, social impact, ask your grandchildren, for those who have. They know what they're doing, and we can channel that through a proper balance on how to live with digital technology in a society. And certainly mathematics. Mathematics is so important, neglected. It's the foundation of AI, computational data, and in the era of data that are the new oil of the 21st century, strategic decision at the government level, corporate level, national level has to be supported by proper data. So that's very important in the present. Also, information technology help in addressing preparedness. We have to be prepared for the future. If you look at the frequency, 2003 SARS, 2011 MERS, 2019 COVID, I would not be here, but the next pandemic will come sometime in 2035, 2030. Look at that because the trend is there. I will look from the clouds, I do cloud computing out there, and then we'll look how today we can prepare for the future. So there are new technology that help. For example, they call public health response tool, the lot digital tool now, citizen digital data capture, proximity sensing. You can use a smart badge. You get too close, it pushes you out for protecting from infection, but it affects interpersonal relationship. I let you go through your wildest imagination. And forecasting network using disease model. So overall, I think that with all this, it's not new to humankind. I was involved heavily in the mitigation of the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. A nuclear disaster, a pandemic, a genocide are all disasters. As human, our behavior change according to disaster, whatever the trigger for that. So I learned a wisdom that apply to whatever I try to do, that when you face a situation that you have never seen before, you have to address it with approach that you never have done before. So it's new, be creative. And last point to come back to ASEAN, Mr. Chair, is that you said rightly, the story of the father putting 6 sticks. I would say that we should put 10 sticks and soon 11 sticks with Timor-Leste coming in next year, hopefully, that united we will stand very strong. So beside this historical and technical consideration, the success of any roadmap to building resilience and solid recovery post-pandemic has to be at least regional, if not global. The success will depend on the intense and transparent collaboration between ASEAN members, especially in data sharing. That is the pillar of establishing both economic recovery and the preparedness for future pandemics. So unity, you're right, Mr. Chair, is crucial if ASEAN wish to sail safely through any storm in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Chen, for a good humanistic opening where you balance technology with human, what we should call humanistic thoughts, so that there is proper work-life balance between us and the world and the economic. Only we can't just be chasing after money. We have to look at how we have, as humans, how we can develop. And as a training psychoanalyst, I know the impact of transgenerational transmission of trauma from the atomic world, how the Japanese have been affected, the Holocaust. And then I do agree with you that the pandemic will also be creating a kind of a generational transmission of trauma, because the younger generation, when they grow up, they will still be thinking about the trauma of this pandemic and how at 2-3 years old they were still wearing the mask. We will move on to the next speaker. I want to switch between the online and those speakers present. So I would like to call upon Tan Sri Dr. Munir Majid as our next participant, presenter. Tan Sri Dr. Munir has been quite vocal in his views about how ASEAN should move forward. Given the disruptions during the pandemic, how, Tan Sri Dr. Munir, could you please share with us your thoughts on the future of ASEAN, specifically in relation to RCEP and CPTPP? Are we being over-ambitious? Given our past 55 years, how do you see the future of ASEAN? Over to you, Tan Sri Dr. Munir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Basiha. I hope you all can hear me. And distinguished panelists, I would like to echo the sentiment of our first speaker just now and underline my points in respect of the need for us all in ASEAN, whether at RCEP level, but certainly at ASEAN level, to actually not be fixated with economic growth. It is important, but it should not become a fetish. And it should not become a fetish because we should have learned from the pandemic just past that our lack of preparation to face the pandemic had various costs. I'm not saying that we did nothing, but I'm saying we had a lack of preparation, and then we did something when the pandemic hit us. And now, of course, there is the ASEAN Center for emerging and existing emergencies, diseases, which is a good thing. But as with ASEAN, centers and studies and work plans are all very good. But how do we activate action when something hits us? And in this past pandemic, we activated something called, just to give you an alphabet soup, the ACCWGPHE, which is the ASEAN Consultative Council Working Group on Public Health Emergencies. What we in the private sector called for, on the other hand, is for quick decision-making, not working groups. And this is still not in place. And we would like to urge ASEAN decision makers, even as we talk about growth and so on, to make sure that we are armed to face the pandemic when it next comes, whether it's in 2035 or even sooner. And therefore, it is important that the private sector and the public sector work together. And the private sector has been pushing in wanting to work together with the public sector in respect of public health emergencies. We created at the ASEAN Business Advisory Council level, a healthcare working group, point number one. Point number two, we have asked for this healthcare working group at ASEAN Business Advisory Council to work together with the ACCWGPHE, okay, that working group on public health emergency. Now, until today, we have been heard but not admitted into that working group. It is very important that experts on the public, on the private sector are brought into the decision-making process and thought process at the ASEAN public sector level. Let me tell you that the private health sector in ASEAN comprises about 53% of the total health sector. So it's a substantial part of the health sector, and therefore it should be brought in to address oncoming, seen or unseen, public health emergencies and diseases. So that's my point number one. If we don't do that, all this talk about RCEP, which is 1/3 of almost everything in the world, and CPTPP, which has of course had enormous effect in terms of export growth for some countries within ASEAN who are members of the CPTPP, like Vietnam, for example. But we also must bear in mind that a lot of that growth came not just because of the existence of new markets in Mexico and Canada, particularly, which are not available to ASEAN ordinary members, as it were, who are not CPTPP members, but it was also a result of relocation out of China. So many factors have actually conspired to make sure that countries like Vietnam, for example, are well placed to take advantage of CPTPP and RCEP. And China itself has done very quick, enormous studies of how to take advantage of RCEP. And it wants to join the CPTPP, which is very interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of growth, but we cut from under our feet if we're not prepared to face the next public health emergency. That's my point number one. Now, point number two is something which is staring us in the face, which we are not yet doing enough of. Everyone's having plans. This has got to do with sustainability, the green economy. And the green economy, the risks of global warming are upon us, I mean, it's not a fictitious or certain academic matter. They're upon us. The recent floods in Pakistan, which affected 33 million people, should be warning to us all of the need not just to talk about, but to take action on conservation and on sustainability. And it is not just Pakistan that's come closer home to ASEAN itself. Forest fires, rise in sea levels, devastating floods. That 77% of Southeast Asians are living along the coast or in low-lying deltas, which are threatened by floods. This is not just, as I said, academic. In 2019, for example, 40% of Indonesia's season zones experienced longer dry seasons. And there was a 10% decline in rice production. There were losses from forest fires of $5 billion. So clearly, this is not academic, and it costs economies a lot of money. Action must be taken, and as countries, including ASEAN member states, commit to net zero over a number of years and so on, steps must be taken to make sure that in international investment and trade, ASEAN is not adversely affected. I'm bringing this in so as people can see the economic sense of potential loss if they do not take action, not to mention human lives and so on, cost, which is more important. But of course, since we are fixated with growth and economics, we even take, for example, the EU's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is set to be introduced from 2023. And there's no time to lose, to ensure that we transition to green energy, for example. And we need to make that transition. We need to get the financing for that transition. And I think there have been a lot of studies done on what may be needed to increase investment for power capacity expansion in ASEAN, the scenario by ASEAN member states is 508 billion. There is potential to be exploited by looking at the green energy and renewable energy policies of investment houses. And so therefore, when you look from the investment supply end, there is obviously going to be shortage. But as I said, the point to note is they must be vigorously attracted. You must show interest, inclination to transit, to move, to actually accept the fact that climate, global warming is a threat. It is before us, and that we are taking action to stop it or reduce it. Therefore, I would suggest that there should be a public-private, like I did for healthcare, ESG framework for implementation of transition, particularly transition into energy, transition for green energy. I mean, the transmission costs of dirty carbon emissions that comes from energy activities of humans is 3/4 of the total transmission cost. Therefore, a focus on this would be very useful. And it could, if we set up the public-private ESG framework, it could address holistically the following issues: government measurement and intervention in green energy performance of the business sector itself. Are they just talking and not doing? The carrot and stick fiscal approaches to make sure that they move along with the risk before the whole globe, and avenues of green transition finance. Just for three areas that we could try to concentrate our minds and work and targets to be achieved. And I think to end, yes, growth, important, prospects, not brilliant right now with the state of the world economy, but good that we have RCEP, that we have CPTPP. But don't forget crushing challenges that are coming and already here from climate change. And do not forget the lessons of public health that we do not seem to have learned enough. We are relaxing the moment the pandemic receded. Therefore, I suggest we continue to work, even as we try to take advantage of the growth potential of the RCEP, CPTPP, and whatever else. So, Mr. Chairman, those are my comments for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tan Sri, Dr. Munir, and you touched on green energy, and you may not have had the opportunity to see the opening ceremony this morning. The Prime Minister of Cambodia touched exactly on that same point, and he said we should move towards this sector of green zone. And the natural disasters across the world, the floods, fires, and then the pandemic has created better awareness, and the healthcare system, green energy and sustainability, these are very key things for the future of ASEAN and also the world at large, I think. Okay, we will move on to the third presenter, and Mr. Lennon Tan. You are the representative of the manufacturing, you are the president of the Singapore Manufacturing Association. And I would like to see, I mean, Singapore is admittedly the most advanced of the 10 member ASEAN countries. And you have held a very good strategy of moving from labor intensive to more technologically advanced industries using less labor force. And how ASEAN, the rest of the ASEAN members who may not be as advanced as Singapore, can learn from the Singapore experience in moving up into the value chain. we may not necessarily have to go through the Singapore lesson, because with AI and with what I will call the new norms, we can skip some steps and move to advanced industries as well. So please share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Chairman. His Excellencies, my distinguished panelists. I'd like to start off my session by quoting one of our Minister of State from our Ministry of Trade and Industry, Mr. Alvin Tan. He said, "We are jumping from a hot pandemic and into a hot war, hot prices, and an even hotter planet." I think that kind of sums up from the many distinguished speakers, also from our speech from last night, our Deputy Prime Minister, Prof. We mentioned this change of event happened one after another. And who knows what's to come with the rising tension in the Taiwan Straits. So I want to say that as businesses, change is the only norm that we have to bring forth ourselves in terms of how we plan and how we do. Now I want to latch on. I think the two speakers before me, right, has spoken a lot about climate change, sustainability, and unfortunately I need to emphasize that one more time. SMF, Singapore Manufacturing Federation, represent 5,200 members, all manufacturing, ranges from the multinationals who manufacture in Singapore to the government-linked manufacturers to roughly about 90% SMEs. Now, our multinational members tell us in one of the coffee sessions that we had, dialogue session, and they said, Singapore businesses will have a rude awakening in about 3 to 5 years from now. They will receive a letter from their MNC customers who they've been supplying for years. And the letter is going to say, in 6 months' time or in 1 year's time, you have to meet all these standards in terms of your sustainability, your ESG, else we cannot buy from you anymore. And if you wait until then to react, you'll be too late. Someone else, some new manufacturer will eat your lunch, right? So I think I need to emphasize this one more time. And in Singapore, we have a manufacturing 2030 vision, and that is to increase. This is back in the year 2000. So in 10 years, that's to increase our manufacturing output by 50% in 10 years. And yet, we will have to still achieve carbon neutrality in 2030. How do you do that? Manufacturing, to a certain extent, does pollute in one way or another, and how do you manage that? And that is the challenge that my members and my government is faced with. And that's why a lot of our task force, a lot of our energy is built to look into how we can help all these businesses transform. And transformation doesn't take 1 year, 2 years. It takes 3 to 5 years of careful planning, and how do you scale from there. Now, sustainability is also important because even though you have your RCEP, you have a CPTPP, and if your products doesn't meet the requirement, it doesn't matter, whatever free trade agreement that you have. So in that sense, we are looking into, at least for my members, we are looking into, very much a lot of us are looking into China plus one manufacturing approach, which looking at the geopolitical situation, China for Chinese market, and the plus one in ASEAN, and that is the trust that we're going through, And we are encouraging our manufacturing partners as well as manufacturers to go into ASEAN to seek out suitable sites for them to do their +1. And obviously, Cambodia is one of such destinations that many of our manufacturers would like to explore. So something on the RCEP and CPTPP. As manufacturer, obviously, we welcome this, especially the RCEP that's recently launched. We see that this is really all the FTAs blend into one comprehensive one and simplify the processes instead of multiple ASEAN FTAs to different regions. We now have one. But businesses have reflect that, in fact, this is it is not something very straightforward. It's currently still very manual. For most manufacturers, they don't know how to proceed for the smaller size manufacturers. The larger ones have feedback that they couldn't yet do a lot of self-declarations. The country of origin sometimes was subject to audit, especially by China and South Korea. So you requires to do additional audits. So they cannot put all the processes into their ERP system and making the process very manual. And therefore, sometimes they default back to the FTAs, the previous FTAs they have. So I will encourage the members of the RCEP to streamline the process and make it more easier for companies to adopt some of the requirements. Now, obviously, we've done our research. We know that the report from Brookings Institute say the RCEP would add 209 billion annually to the world income, 500 billion to world trade, and for the CPTPP, especially with the future involvement of China and India, it's going to go beyond 147 billion by 2030. So we as businesses, we look forward to, and we want to learn as these two trade evolve, these trade agreements evolve. And I think I will end there, and I look forward to listening from the other panelists and what their views are on this too. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you emphasized on the ESG and how if we are not prepared, then we will have surprises waiting from the MNCs. And everybody is under pressure to comply with the ESG requirements. And this is the advantage for newly starting economies like Cambodia and others, because we can do right from the beginning. We can jump some of the stages that Singapore or Malaysia had to go through, and you start your industrialization with the new norm, as it were, complying with the ESG, and that is an advantage for the rest of the ASEAN who are willing to catch up with the other advanced economies in the country. Thank you. Now we will move to Professor Suthiphand Chirathivat, and he's a member of the ASEAN Studies Center. Could you, Professor, elaborate and comment on what has been said about RCEP and how this partnership could help accelerate economic growth in ASEAN? You may also add on to the, of course, not just necessarily RCEP, CPTPP as well. Thank you.
Could you hear me from Bangkok?
Yes,
could you?
We can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay. First of all, let me thank the joint organizers, in particular Michael and his team for the kind invitation so I could join this forum. I enjoy very much previous speakers, in particular my a good friend, Excellency Rethy, and also Dato Munir for their very big picture and thing is try to providing us about the what will lead us to in a post-pandemic world we are now living. And in fact, it's the session that has two distinguish what do you call the idea, one about the what would be the kind of post-pandemic recovery, and the second question is about that what the chairperson just asking me about the practical part on the RCEP and CPTPP. But let me just say a few words on the first part because I think it's important before I could say what about the impact of pandemic and post-recovery on RCEP and CPTPP and for our ASEAN. I join our colleagues that recovery, what we say today after 2 years on, and we have much experiences, lesson learned. The colleagues try to look at the real past, the long history, and project the future. That we are not safe anymore, and quite a risky and dangerous ASEAN that we has just gone through. So that's one thing that I think is very important to keep in mind. This kind of pandemic could come back, in the years ahead. And for us, this is the biggest so-called kind of pandemic in our lifetime. And it might be more frequent. So that's something that I said this is and quite unpredictable, not only uncertain, and predictability kind of thing we used to think that we've been able to predict here and there, no longer true when you look through even the IMF or World Bank. We keep changing economic growth, like Dr. Munir tried to say, growth still important, but no longer. The big words from not only that the unpredictability will be the big part of our life moving to the future, as well as the kind of growth. We might not be able to say that the kind of growth we have like the past. We not mentioned yet that when we have the smooth era of globalization, so far so good, by the end of the Cold War. And now the kind of rocky road we have, the pandemic set up back very much in terms of kind of the growth. The ASEAN still not too bad compared to many parts of the world, but yet we quite suffer like many other parts of the world. So I would say transformation is important in the way we move into the future. We might not only say economic growth, but economic transformation, social transformation, political transformation, all dimensions of transformation will play very big part in the kind of change like the turn from the private sector, from our Singaporean just mentioned. I think transformation would be more the key rather than putting emphasis on growth only. That will be our facet of our life. And that's how we come through another point that we discussed now, because pandemic shown us very well, everything is become interlinked, and the kind of intersection that we have now of health with economy, We just again the Ukraine invasion and Russian invasion in Ukraine is also kind of the war environment and the impact. This is another intersection. So the intersection from of pandemic to war to what next, this is something kind of the repeating crisis that we living unknown. And I need to present to you all as well about the kind of combination following the pandemic. First is about the disruption. We know everything about the word disruption for everything. That we learn for our life and livelihood, the kind of production from factory to trade to logistics to transport to connectivity. I think this is the big dimension, and by the second year, we all learn that we're going to have the kind of smooth production, trade, and it's caused us quite the supply chain and the kind of supply of goods and service in a new way that put inflation on everyone. I think we need to mention as well, we need to another kind of a situation where inflation very high, and the kind of policymaker needs to deal with the hardship of everyone. If you think about the even the latest UN Human Development Index, just try to say that more than 90% of the country become more poor, become more hardship because of a pandemic, and now we have inflation from energy to food to many things in life that we keep in mind. That's very important. It will take a few years. It will not be easy for business anymore, because if you think about the policymakers have to run the kind of new macro policy, follow the list of many countries in the West, the US Fed in particular has just raised many rounds of interest rate. So again, the kind of cheap money, cheap credit that we have been from the past 2008, 2009 financial crisis, we no longer support kind of a growth that we had. So this is also a kind of new situation of the macroeconomic picture that we have to keep in mind, that cheap money no longer, so the higher cost of capital around the country, and the debt problem adding to the pandemic, how to manage the debt in our respective economy. So that's why, again, coming back to, perhaps I will not have time to mention much about the RCEP is, I like to say in this round of talk that that's why, again, the kind of the recovery we look into the next few years, and the RCEP just come with the picture, in addition to the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community. I believe very much RCEP and CPTPP, if that would be a broader regional integration framework, it should support our ASEAN Economic Community. And in that sense, I think we're still lucky to have this scope, and we just start in 2022 this year for RCEP. And for the moment, we have only 2 countries of ASEAN joining the CPTPP, not yet the rest of ASEAN. I think Malaysia, Tan Sri Munir might say to us very well how what's your thought about the CPTPP? Thailand might try to apply for membership, but you're already in. Why not you start yet? But again, of course, that perhaps more higher standard for of CPTPP. Why? I think that RCEP, ASEAN has more control, and the so-called like ASEAN is fully participate in that RCPP. So I think it's important to channel that AEC to a broader regional concept of RCPP, which I believe is less or least trade diversion and very much trade creation in terms of trade creation. So I believe that would add very much the value to our ASEAN. So this is just a first year, of course. Along the way, there will be the problems in terms of, like you say, the paper and the audits and all that from the private sector. But again, what we try to come up with this RCPP because we're dealing with the notables of the past, you know, that we have so much FTA with many partners. So the value also of RCPP, RCEP is to also harmonize and have the kind of rule origin, you know, the kind of common rule of origin in order to have a better goods circulation in ASEAN, as well as the liberalized services and many other things that are important. So I would say it's important to moving ahead with RCEP, of course. Back to the last issue about the how, I would say that we need to also transform RCEP to fit the future world, which means based on very much the kind of environment that's going to be the very much the kind of the issue that we will face, not only in our region, but into the outside the broader region, if our goods and services export to the outside of the region. So we need to make sure is make sure that it is corresponding to the kind of the new world climate change, and also be sustainable, and also be more equitable to everyone that you know, we have big and small firms, we have the whole population who behind it. So very inclusive. We have to think about the inclusivity as well. So let me end perhaps this round of talk, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Professor. And you rightly said predictability is becoming more complex because of the war. There are a lot of things which are outside our control. I mean, the pandemic, nobody had control on how it spread and how it was creating havoc across the globe. The wars, which are also, again, beyond our control. Even the 10 ASEAN economies work peacefully towards greater development and economic prosperity. Outside forces can interrupt and disrupt our growth. Therefore, it becomes more complex, and then the transformation and the political uncertainty across the world also creates its own complexity. Now we will move to Dr. Kim. You are the only person from outside, from South Korea, to be here. So we are looking forward to how you view ASEAN and how the 55 years of ASEAN's growth, has it been to the satisfaction as an outsider? We are all in the dance floor. You are looking at us from the balcony, and how your views on our growth will be a very useful tip for us, because sometimes they say it's go slow, you know, I'm in a hurry, go slow. So are we moving at a tortoise pace, or are we expected to run like the rabbit? Although the proverbial story says the tortoise was the one which won the race ultimately. How is ASEAN's pace in developing itself? We'd like to hear your views.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much for the invitation, having me, especially the Tan Sri Michael Yeoh, for the very meaningful conference. And then, as the Mr. Chair already mentioned, I am from South Korea, so it's out of the ASEAN. Of course, I have visited so many times, in ASEAN countries, including Cambodia, but anyway, it's very, I think that very valuable opportunities to address my views on the how to, what is the prospects for the ASEAN countries after pandemic, and especially in terms of the RCEP and the CPTPP. And let me just get straight to the point that the future of the ASEAN economy is very, very bright. Inter-pandemic era. And of course, the pandemic will be reiterated in the future. So I think that rather than talking about the post-pandemic, than just talking about the inter-pandemic era, I confess. Let me elaborate some things about the RCEP and then CPTPP, and also I will add up something about the IPF as well. The first of all, RCEP is very meaningful because it is the first regional mega FTA in East Asia. Of course, itself is very important. But in terms of the tariff reduction, the impact of RCEP is very minimal. Just very minimal the additive impact on the existing FTAs. But in terms of the boosting trade and investment in this region, it has some meaningful impact because it can create the consolidated rules of origin, and it especially for the very beneficial to the not only ASEAN countries but also 3 countries of the China, Japan, and South Korea, and also between the ASEAN and the 3 countries as well. And so this is important impact. But RCEP has just started this year, and then one of the more the salient features of the RCEP is that RCEP, through the negotiation of RCEP, the ASEAN has played a pivotal role in negotiation. So it means that then in RCEP, the ASEAN centrality was fully acknowledged and respected. So this is a very important thing. Let me talk about the CPTPP. CPTPP is different from the, of course, RCEP because only 4 countries of the ASEAN member countries are included in CPTPP. So Malaysia, and then Singapore, Brunei, and then Vietnam. And so it's a kind of the does not respect the ASEAN centrality because each member countries, some member countries are just a member of the CPTPP. And we have already experienced the more than 2 years of the entry into force of the CPTPP. So we know that what the CPTPP's impact on this region. And then Vietnam is the most beneficial country of the CPTPP, followed by Malaysia and the other 2 countries. And CPTPP includes the many different provisions rather than the RCEP, something like a state-owned enterprise provision, labor and environment provision, transparency, competition, telecommunication services, and then financial services, which means that all of these kind of provisions more advanced contribute to the CPTPP to make the more advanced trade pact. And it's also challenging to the other countries as well, But the most important impact of the CPTPP on this region is that not only the four member countries of the CPTPP, but also the remaining 6 member countries will be get the benefits, great benefits from this CPTPP by enhancing the regulatory harmonization in other countries. Of course, I mean, this kind of the channel can be effective through the role of the active role of the ASEAN leaders and the ASEAN Secretariat, expanding and then prospering the benefit of the CPTPP could be very important, and then this is also the challenges for the ASEAN countries and but ASEAN leaders, and so this is another very important thing. And let me lastly, I'll talk about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because it's now it's very important. IPF is initiated not by the East Asian countries or ASEAN, but initiated by the Biden administration. So IPF is the lawyer, is beneficial to the United States interest. Of course, we East Asian countries can make use of this kind of opportunities to improve our economic environment. But basically, this IPF initiative is designed by the United States. So we need to develop our own Indo-Pacific strategy. And very fortunately that, the ASEAN countries is strategically located in the Indo-Pacific oceans. So I think that the ASEAN countries, the best grouping, economic entity giant, to make use of its own Indo-Pacific economic strategy. And I know that ASEAN has already initiated the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I don't think that is just a full-fledged strategy. So for me, it seems to me that the ASEAN version Indo-Pacific strategy should be developed more to make use of all these kind of opportunities. To boost the trade and investment and economic security and the supply chain resilience and the decarbonization, the infrastructure building, and also anti-corruption and the taxation issues. All of these kind of issues should be the target for the discussion in this region, I think. Okay, so let me just, by adding the Korean version of the Indo-Pacific, strategy. We are now also very interested in the Korean version of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and then in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Korea, then the ASEAN is together with India the most important reasons that we are thinking of for cooperation. And we are now very interested in the trilateral cooperation between Korea and other country and then the ASEAN countries. So I think that we need to cooperate more about the trilateral cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. And yes, we agree that, of course, RCEP is something that ASEAN have already struggled and put in place. CPTPP takes a little longer because of some of the key issues that has to be addressed by the ASEAN nations. And IP strategy is something that we need to look at as well. I have been told by the organizers that we have to stop at 11. I was given the impression that we have until 11:15. But anyway, we do have 2 more presenters. We will move to Dr. Sin Yang from ADB, and I will ask her to say, as a development banker, could you share your views as what kind of industries ASEAN should focus in future? What are the comparative advantages ASEAN as a bloc has, and how could we capitalize on our advantages to accelerate economic growth in ASEAN? Also, as an ADP rep, could you give a helicopter view of the entire Asia, and please share with us the success of ASEAN as you see as a banker to the rest of Asia? Over to you, Dr. Sin Yang.
Oh, thank you, Chairman, distinguished panelists, for also inviting me here to share some study findings and also the views. Well, the pandemic has underscored the importance of open trade and investment. We have seen many disruptions across trade and then supply chain across the region during the pandemic. And what we also saw is the important role of international trade agreements in reversing or at least mitigating the adverse effect of the pandemic or any other global and regional health crisis. The countries with the at least the regional trade agreements were more likely to have avoided the initial adverse effect of the pandemic on the exports of essential goods, including the medical and the vaccine and as well as the food products. And they were more likely to have imported these essential medical goods from the regional partners involved in the primary and then secondary packaging and distribution stages of these important medical value chains. We have also seen that the trade tariff barriers remain fairly low in developed and many, in fact, developing countries in Asia. But even with these preferential trade agreements, tariff remain quite specific for some of these essential medical products. And these have to be further removed and addressed. So the following could be a good policy recommendations. First, governments should identify the multiple sources of these suppliers for the smooth and the continuous flow of the essential goods and enhance the investment in their production to diversify the risks. Much of the production and trade of the essential medical goods have been concentrated among a few developed countries and a handful of developing economies, including the high and middle income economies. Majority of the Southeast Asian developing countries are yet to catch up in trade for these goods. They are highly dependent on imports and lack manufacturing capacity to produce them locally. The governments should also look for the bilateral and regional cooperation to institutionalize trade with bigger Asian economies, therefore reducing the possibility of supply chain disruptions emanating from other external partners or developed economies outside the region. In this regard, regional trade agreements such as these ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, ASEAN +1 Free Trade Agreement, and especially RCEP could be quite important. Even the bilateral regional cooperation among Asian economies could increase opportunity for trade and improves access to essential goods, especially during the crisis. And second, it is important to have stronger cross-continental trade agreements. At this juncture, much of this trade for the essential medical and then vaccine manufacturing and packaging materials for distribution have been concentrated among developed economies. APEC measures and CPTPP have a strong role to play in building strategic relations between the developing economies and the emerging market economies around the region. Availability of the vaccines and the timely testing of these vaccine and the pharmaceutical products could have helped the region's economies to recover from the pandemic earlier. The governments therefore should work together to lower or at least eliminate trade barriers, including tariffs, customs inefficiency, and other infrastructure bottlenecks that are essential for strengthening the value chain and especially making them resilient. And thirdly, we need to explore new models of the regional trade agreements and the different provisions to facilitate the trade, especially during the emergency situation and the health crisis. Governments should prioritize reducing regulatory heterogeneity among members through mutual recognition or other types of cooperation. The development of the specific provisions in regional trade agreements such as RCEP to respond quickly and efficiently to health crisis and enhance countries' preparedness should be further explored. Drafting guidelines could be important, especially these guidelines should cover areas such as the definitions of the public health emergency or shortage of essential goods, classifications of essential goods, and adoption of international standards for regulatory cooperation. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinyang, about highlighting on the supply chain disruption, how we need to be prepared for the essential products during an emergency, etc. And because of time, I would like to move on to our last presenter for today from the Asian Vision Institute, Dr. Chiang. As president of the Asian Vision Institute, I'm sure you would have had some research on the future of ASEAN. And could you share your vision of ASEAN in the long term and how you see ASEAN as an economic bloc in the next 10 to 20 years?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Excellency, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Looking forward, what we can see is change is constant, disruption is new normal, and new type of leadership is necessary. I just would like to focus on what kind of leadership required. First, I think state or non-state actors or private corporations, you need to understand the issue in a more holistic and systematic way. The compartmentalization of thinking and acting will not help. So that's why we need more of multidisciplinary or cross-sectoral approach toward the issues, because it becomes more systematic and more complex. So this kind of complex solutions to the complex issue would be required for a new type of leadership that you need to cross the boundary of your field of expertise or what you're doing, open a new room for thinking and acting. So the future ASEAN will exist. Several decades ago, some may accuse that ASEAN would collapse. But my argument is ASEAN still exists. Of course, ASEAN is not a perfect organization. So don't expect ASEAN to solve all the problems we are facing. But ASEAN gives a platform for dialogue and for idea generations. So I'm glad that Tan Sri Michael Yeo founded the ASEAN Economic Club, which was officially inaugurated today under the presence of Prime Minister Hun Sen and other dignitaries. So these ASEAN economic clubs can serve as economic intelligence analysts, can serve as a platform for dialogue, can serve as a platform for partnership building. And this partnership building is not only between the private and the public sector, but we call it public-private people partnership. And I think some of us mentioned about the people-centered approach to economic development and community building. So ASEAN Economic Community, moving forward, need to have this kind of philosophy of people-centric regional integrations and economic development. And the proposal that Prime Minister Hun Sen mentioned this morning with regards to the ASEAN New Green Deal or Green Special Economic Zone. So this is a way forward. A green economy, green financing, green investment related to ESG investment, that is a new source of growth. We need to find new source of growth. And anything related to green economy, I think this is new source of growth that we can tap into. Second is a digital ASEAN. But we need to ensure that digital economy must be inclusive. Because we also observe the gap, digital gap, or between the countries and within the different communities in the region. So we need to ensure that digital transformation is inclusive, bringing more women into this digital economy. So my last point here is with regards to, again, to the Prime Minister Hun Sen's proposal on establishing RCEP Secretariat in Cambodia. We are already ready, and we need to seek the support from all ASEAN member states and the dialogue partners, especially those signatory to RCEP, to have the Secretariat of RCEP, General Secretary of RCEP here in Phnom Penh. Why? Because RCEP negotiations started here 10 years ago, and 10 years later we start enforcing it. So Cambodia deserves this kind of role to play, and if can work with the ASEAN Economic Club to support RCEP implementation, then would bring more impact to the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cheng, and hopefully with your role in the ASEAN Economic Club, you can contribute for your thoughts as a powerful think tank for ASEAN in future. And disruption is normal, change is constant, compartmentalization, multidisciplinary approach, all these are very important points that we need to bear in mind. And of course, new leadership, also the style of leadership is important. In my tremendous pressure by the organizer, I almost forgot that we have one more speaker left. That's Dr. Rupa from, she's the Director of Trade and Investment and Innovation Division of from the United Nations. My apologies, Dr. Rupa. And could you please give your views? You are the last speaker, so you have the what I call the liberty to discuss on whatever we have been said and what is missing. I would leave it to you to give us the concluding session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I thank the organizers for this opportunity. I think we've really got a very sort of rounded view of all the issues that are before us, and the need for humanism, the need for a multidisciplinary approach, looking at the geopolitical uncertainties, etc. Now, I think I'll just focus a little bit more on the economic side. I understand that growth alone is not the sole thing that we have to look at here in the context of regional agreements, but growth is essential, because without that, you will not get the buy-in and the confidence for countries to continue to implement or be part of such agreements. So here, I think, even though there is a lot of phasing in of many of the commitments, the potential that CPTPP and RCEP provide in terms of reorganizing of supply chains or rebuilding of supply chains, keeping markets open and predictable in terms of trade and investment, assuming that countries do follow through on their commitments, implement them in time, that I think is very essential, because for scale economies, you do need these kinds of agreements. So this is one important part, I feel, that would help recovery of the countries. Of course, trade liberalization commitments, if they're phased in over a very long period of time, they'll be trickle, and Mr. Kim mentioned about that. However, the fact that you have access to new markets in the case of countries like Malaysia and Vietnam in the context of CPTPP, or you have countries like China, big trade partners, which are going to eliminate about 70% of their tariffs on products imported from ASEAN, this provides tremendous opportunity. So I think we should not deny the huge market access opportunities that would come from trade liberalization. Added to that is, of course, the consolidation of rules of origin. And so by reducing complexity of trade, bringing down trade costs, harmonizing rules and procedures, digitalizing trade, etc. All this standardization would also help in the reorganizing of value chains and improve trade and operational efficiencies. I think one thing that's very important when you look at the development of sectors, high-tech sectors like electronics and automobiles, where parts and components have to move across different countries, this kind of reorganization, this kind of predictability and utilization of tariff preferences can play a very important role. The second thing that has been also mentioned is about investment. I think Mr. Kim mentioned about the complementary nature of regional investment liberalization that these agreements potentially allow. So again, there are commitments here to lock in market access, to open up many more service sectors, for instance. This again, if you look at how trade and FDI go together, you can't talk of trade without having FDI. It's almost like the relocation of investment and manufacturing, which then facilitates the trade. So again, I think this is a great opportunity in terms of expediting recovery and future development. There will be a lot of other benefits that will come, like technology and knowledge transfer, creation of jobs, value chain linkages, and just generally greater business to business ties that could be developed because of investment liberalization. Now, the open regionalism aspect of RCEP in particular, I think makes it all the more attractive because the joining of more countries and bigger markets can further enhance the scale economies that I'm talking of. The regulatory cooperation aspect is extremely important. One area which we haven't talked about enough, it's been mentioned, I think it's the digital economy. Really, where there are two aspects here. One is the digitalization of trade. So the trade facilitation and cooperation that will happen in the context of such agreements can actually expedite the digitalization of trade. So that's very important in further bringing down trade costs and improving efficiency. But the other part is, of course, the development of e-commerce. So the digital economy that would be developed because of, the commitments countries have made or the institutional sort of mechanisms that are there in these agreements regarding e-commerce and some of the advanced rule making that is likely to happen can really help ASEAN members to diversify their trade baskets and create new economic opportunities for their businesses, including MSMEs, through digital trade. And another channel, which I think we also need to emphasize, this is more long-term in nature, but this is very important, it's institutional capacity development, because many of the mechanisms that come with these agreements help you develop that regulatory and institutional capacity, help you set higher standards, set regulations, and provide you the roadmap for future liberalization. So overall, I think much depends upon how committed countries are, what sort of mechanisms they develop, whether they ratify in some cases some of these agreements. However, countries also need to understand that they need to put in supporting domestic policies. It's not just enough. So you will have to develop capacity domestically as well if you want to really leverage the opportunities that are created. So if I just summarize, I think there are 6-7 things I would say looking ahead. One is more on digital cooperation. Second, more on MSME integration, including embedding sustainability principles in MSMEs as they become part of value chains. Another is maybe looking at provisions to ensure flow of goods and services in times of crises. So some sort of preparedness for crisis and shocks. More of regulatory and institutional cooperation on standards, data, and mobility of people and recognition of qualifications, a very important area if you want to expand business. Of course, greater commitment and implementation of your commitments, sustainability of trade and value chains. So sustainable and digital trade facilitation, very important. And finally, being aware of the new geopolitical alliances that are developing as you leverage the opportunities. Thank you very much.
I'm glad I kept Dr. Rupa as the last speaker. She summarized excellently on what the 6 points that we need to take note of. With that, I call this session to a close, and please give your appreciation to both our online speakers as well as those present here.